Hi, this is Dr. Rosaletti. This screencast is part of a series about creating rubrics for the assessing language performance, and these slides come from a pre-conference institute that I led with Dr. Don McCormick at TESOL 2019. Reminder that rubrics are used for performance-based assessment, where the learner performs the skill, and the purpose is to evaluate the quality of that performance, or our students' performance, because in performance-based assessment there is not a clear right and wrong answers. We cannot create an answer key. The students have freedom of how to respond, and we need to evaluate the quality of the performance. It's recommended that we assess performance-based tasks with analytic rubrics, and analytic rubrics list multiple traits to evaluate, which I'm calling categories. There are multiple categories that we consider, and in an analytic rubric, it's possible to give separate ratings for each of those traits or each of those categories. A student can be high in vocabulary but low in pronunciation, or the reverse. They're not connected. As a reminder, the categories that are going to be in the rubric are going to come directly from the learning objectives for the assessment, and the levels of performance are descriptions of the quality, and both of these are context specific. How much can we evaluate? Well, usually the number of categories are going to be between 4 and 6. It's just simply difficult to assess more than 5 traits at one time. That doesn't mean we're limited to only assessing 5 parts of a speaking or writing skill, but in any one assessment, we're going to have to focus on those. And again, since those are context specific, coming straight from your learning objectives, you can get guidance on what categories based on what are the skills that you're building in that unit. This is also a matter of practicality, but also reliability. It's just difficult to be reliable if we're trying to watch more than 5 things in an essay or a speech. And the levels of student performance, we're usually going to distinguish between 3 and 5 levels. If there's too few or too many, it becomes difficult to match the performance of from the student's work to the most accurate description in the rubric. It's hard. If there's only 2, you're like, oh, is it this one or this one? But if it's too many, it's also difficult to figure out if it's here or if it's here. And we also might want to consider how these 2 slides interact. For instance, if for some reason you have to measure 6 categories, maybe you want to use only 3 or 4 levels of performance. On the other hand, if you are focused on only 3 categories, maybe you can do 4 or 5 levels of description. So think about how you probably don't want to use the fewest in both or the most, certainly not pushing the number of categories and the number of levels of performance. That rubric might become too big. And in our descriptions, we want to focus on what the learner can do and the effect on the audience. And that's a way to strengthen the reliability. And it's not going to be quality. It's going to be quality and not quantity. We don't want to have to keep track of numbers because that's not a measure of quality. So even before we use it, we can, after it's created, we should review it. So just look at the format in addition to the numbers of categories and levels of performance. Just think about how the rubric looks. Is it easy to use? Is it all on one page? I find it very difficult to use a rubric that I have to flip the pages. I like it to be just on one page. Are the descriptions concise? Is the rubric too crowded? Are the key elements that help you distinguish between levels of performance salient? Maybe you want to think about bullets like in this PowerPoint, or spacing to help make it easier to read, or text enhancement like bolding or underlining. So when you use and go back to the rubric with each performance, you can quickly get to the points that help you differentiate between levels of performance. But we also have to think about beneficial consequences. How does the assessment benefit the learner? In classroom assessment, the goal is always the beneficial consequences to the learner. Will the assessment itself help the student learn? Will getting the results of the assessment help the student? And how will the results help you as the instructor help the student? So there are three main ways that you can build or strengthen the beneficial consequences in an analytic rubric or any assessment, but we're focusing on analytic rubrics here. And one is positive washback, having a process of giving individual feedback and using the assessment results to inform subsequent lessons. Let's look at each one. So positive washback. Positive washback is the idea that having an assessment positively influences learning. For instance, if your students know that they are going to be assessed, their speech pronunciation is going to be assessed tomorrow, they might spend some time practicing the sounds that are difficult for them to pronounce. They might just take some time to practice. Likewise, if they're having a vocabulary test or something, knowing that you're going to be assessed sometimes spurs learning in practice. Another way positive washback can happen is when we give the rubric to the student when the assessment is assigned. For instance, if you say, you have to write a 5-page essay, it's due on Friday. When you give the assignment of what the essay should be about, you should also give the rubric of how it's going to be graded, how the performance will be assessed. Why? Because knowing how you're going to be assessed might improve the performance. For instance, if in your unit you were working on transition words to connect sentences in paragraphs, and that is listed as a learning objective and it shows up as one of the categories, and the student can review that and maybe they will take the time to look at their own work before they submit it to you to make sure that they are using transitions and that those transition words are the appropriate ones for the context. That's just one way that giving the rubric before assessing the students will improve the performance. It will let the students give the best work that they can give by knowing how they were going to be assessed. And since we're going to give the rubric to the students when the assessment is assigned, we have to make sure that the language used in the rubric should be accessible to the learners. Again, this is specific to the context. If I were teaching beginner learners of English, the words that I use in my rubric would be very different from if I were teaching, say, graduate students in an assessment course. I can use different language. And perhaps I want to use full sentences with beginners because I'm modeling that, but for maybe more advanced learners, I can use just phrases because those learners can handle that ambiguity and that choice in how to convey information in a rubric. And another way to build positive washback into your assessment practice is to give time for the students to reflect on their performance. So when we assess our students and give them the results of the rubric, Maybe it's important to explain how to read the results. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the students? For instance, maybe you want to have a process where they'll say, well, my strength is, based on this feedback, my strength is this, and based on this feedback, I'm going to work on this and that. So give them some time to do that. Again, this is context specific. If you build that into your assessment practice, maybe you can be more explicit in the beginning, and then later on the students can do that on their own. Another way to build or strengthen the beneficial consequences with analytic rubric is to have a process for giving individual feedback in addition to just the scores in the analytic rubric. Maybe that's notes in a note section in the rubric, either for each of the categories, or maybe just general, maybe margin feedback or conferences, and give students time to reflect on that. The individual feedback, to summarize. Make sure that if they have questions, there's a place and time for them to ask that. Because if we spend the time to give individual feedback, we want to make sure that the students are reading it and using that to improve their performance. And the third one is to use the assessment results to inform subsequent lessons. Maybe when you get the results of an assessment, you realize you have to reteach something, or that the students need additional practice in the skill or a certain part of the skill, or you have to recycle the concepts, or maybe the results tell you that it's time to move on or accelerate. So another way is, after you've designed the rubric and built it and reviewed it, another important thing is to review it before you actually give it to your students. One idea is to ask other teachers to review the rubric, especially if this is a higher stakes assessment, like a final exam. Think carefully about the response the assessment will elicit. Will whatever prompt you gave them, like the topic, is it aligned with the rubric categories? And a way to figure this out is to do the assessment. If you expect the students to talk for 2 minutes about their hometown, maybe you should talk about your hometown for 2 minutes and see what language you produce. Of course, we do not expect our learners to have a native speaker-like model, but it will give you some insight into what language structures or constructions are typical in that, which might be relevant. So in this rubric, this screencast, we reviewed rubrics and how to build beneficial consequences and review them.